Torveni Ashcrest had not knelt before another living soul in his 32 years of existence. He had knelt before altars. He had knelt before his father's coffin, but never before a person, never before a closed door, and certainly never in the mud of a village so small it did not appear on any map in his kingdom. Yet here he was, knees in the dirt, rain soaking through his riding cloak, staring at a weathered cottage door that had just been shut in his face by a woman he had spent 5 years believing was gone from this world forever. 3 minutes earlier, his universe had still made a kind of terrible sense. He had ridden for 3 days on almost no sleep, chasing rumors so absurd that his beta Corvin had begged him not to follow them. Twin boys in a border village called Thornhaven. 5 years old, shifting into full wolves, effortlessly, at an age when most shifter children could barely sprout a single claw. And their wolves were white. Not gray, not tawny, not brown. White. Pure, impossible, blinding white. The mark of the old bloodline. His bloodline. A bloodline the healers had sworn could not continue through the woman he had cast aside. He had told himself it could not be true. He had repeated this like a prayer through 3 days of hard riding, through rain that never let up, through nameless villages that blurred past like ghost towns in the gray. It could not be true, because the healers had examined her. The council had reviewed the findings and accepted them without question. Leora was barren. The line would end with her. He had believed them. He had chosen duty over devotion. He had severed the bond. And then he had walked into this village, and he had seen them. 2 boys in a muddy clearing behind the cottage, grappling with each other in that reckless, full-bodied way children fight when they think no one is watching. One of them, the taller one, had dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that stopped Torvain's heart. The jawline, the set of the brow, the way he moved, deliberate and watchful even in play. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected 25 years into the past. The smaller one laughed, a bright, sharp sound that cut through the rain, and tackled his brother sideways into the long grass, and mid-fall, without effort, without even seeming to notice what he was doing, the taller boy shifted. 1 second he was a child with scraped knees and a torn shirt. The next, he was a wolf, white as winter moonlight, moving with a grace and fluidity that had no business existing in a body that young. The smaller boy shifted a heartbeat later. Also white. Also perfect. Also everything the kingdom had been told was impossible. Torvain could not feel his legs. He could not feel anything below his chest, because everything above it was on fire. The bond, the one he had severed, the one the healers had cauterized with ritual and wolfsbane and quiet reassurance that the ache would fade, was screaming inside his ribs. Not stirring, not whispering, screaming like a wound ripped open with bare hands after years of pretending the scar did not hurt. A voice called from the cottage, warm and steady and utterly calm, the way you call children in from the rain when supper is ready and the world is ordinary. The 2 white wolves froze, ears swiveling toward the sound, and then they were boys again, scrambling barefoot across the wet grass toward the open door. She stepped into the light. Leora, 5 years older, thinner in the face, harder around the eyes. Her dark hair was braided back the way she used to wear it when she worked the herb gardens at Valdenmere, and she wore a healer's apron stained with the green of fresh poultices and the brown of dried root bark. She looked nothing like a queen. She looked like a woman who had built an entire life from scorched earth with nothing but her own 2 hands and a stubbornness that could shame a mountain. She saw him. He watched the recognition land, watched her gaze travel from his face to his mud-spattered riding cloak, to the silver crest stitched into his collar. He waited for anger, waited for tears, waited for shock, waited for something, anything, to cross her face. She put a hand on each boy's shoulder. She turned them gently around. She walked them back inside. And she closed the door. Torvain stood there, rain running down his face, the most powerful alpha in the realm, and felt every ounce of that power drain out of his body like water through a cracked vessel. He dropped to his knees in the mud and could not get up. The door stayed closed. 5 years and 4 months earlier, the great hall of Valdenmere had been dressed in silence and dread. Leora remembered the torches. She remembered the way the firelight crawled across the stone walls like something alive, casting long, trembling shadows behind the row of councilmen who sat in their high-backed chairs with their hands folded and their faces arranged into careful expressions of practiced sympathy. She remembered the smell of old wood and candle wax and the faint metallic bite of cold stone. She remembered the way her fingers had gone numb in her lap, the way her pulse had flattened into something thin and distant, the way her body had known what was coming long before a single word was spoken. She remembered Lord Aldrich rising first, the senior counselor, gray-bearded and lean, with eyes like 2 chips of wet slate that had never warmed no matter how many times he offered his careful smile. He had been the one pushing hardest. The whispers had reached her months ago, carried on the breath of servants who pitied her, and courtiers who did not. The queen cannot conceive. The bloodline hangs by a thread. The king requires an heir. 2 years of marriage, 2 years of hoping, 2 years of healers pressing cold, clinical hands to her stomach and shaking their heads while she stared at the ceiling and tried to breathe through the suffocating weight of being examined like livestock at a market. Every moon cycle that arrived on time was a public failure. Every pitying glance from a courtier was a wound she learned to absorb without flinching. The kingdom watched her belly the way farmers watch the sky before a drought, desperate and resentful and searching for a sign that never came. She had loved Torvain. That was the part none of them factored into their careful calculations. She had loved him before the crown, before the council, before the great hall and the ceremony and the weight of a title she had never asked for. She had loved the man who laughed too loud at his own terrible jokes and could not cook a single edible meal, but insisted on trying every winter solstice, filling the kitchens with smoke and creative excuses while she doubled over laughing on the floor. She had loved the man who held her face in both hands the night they bonded and whispered against her mouth, "You are the only throne I will ever kneel for." She had believed him. That was her mistake. Lord Aldrich cleared his throat. The sound echoed off the stone like a judge's gavel falling on a sentence already decided. He spoke about duty. He spoke about the realm and the ancient obligation of the bloodline. He spoke about the old laws and the burden of succession and the fragile peace that depended on a clear and undisputed line of inheritance. He spoke for what felt like an eternity, without once looking directly at the woman whose life he was dismantling with every measured word. Then he said the words that ended everything. The council recommends dissolution of the royal bond and the selection of a new Luna capable of producing an heir for the Ashcrest line. The silence that followed was so absolute, Leora could hear the torches breathing on the walls. She looked at Torvain. He sat at the head of the long table, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. His hands were flat on the dark wood, fingers pressed white against the grain. His eyes were fixed on the table in front of him. He would not look at her. "Torvain," she said. "Just his name. Not your majesty. Not my king. Not the title the court demanded. His name, the one she whispered in the dark. The one she pressed into his collarbone with her lips when they were alone, and the crown was just a cold circle of metal sitting on a shelf across the room. He flinched like she had struck him. "Is this what you want?" she asked. Her voice did not shake. She would not allow it to shake. Not here. Not in front of these men who had already decided her fate and were now simply waiting for the formality to conclude. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. She watched his throat work, watched his chest rise and fall once, twice, a slow, controlled breath that was costing him more than anyone in that room would ever understand. "It is what the kingdom needs," he said. He still did not look at her. Something broke in Leora's chest. Not loudly, not with any sound at all. It broke the way ice breaks under slow, relentless pressure, a deep fracture running silently through the center of something that was never supposed to shatter. She stood. She smoothed her dress with steady hands. She looked at the row of councilmen who suddenly found the floor and ceiling and walls absolutely fascinating, and then she looked at the king. The man she had married. The man she had loved with every reckless, unguarded part of herself. The man who had just chosen a throne over a heartbeat. "Then the kingdom can have you," she said. She walked out of the great hall and did not look back. She did not cry until she reached the corridor and the heavy doors had sealed shut behind her. She did not stop crying until she reached her chambers, and even then the tears came in waves that left her gasping. She packed one bag. She left before dawn, while the palace slept, while the guards changed shifts, while the man who was still technically her mate lay awake in a bed they had shared and stared at the ceiling and did nothing to stop her. No one followed. No one searched. Within 3 weeks, the court had absorbed her absence the way a pond absorbs a dropped stone, a brief ripple, then nothing. Within 2 months, a new Luna was selected. Seraphine of House Thalamore, tall and golden-haired, from one of the oldest noble families in the realm. Within 4 months, she and Torvain were bonded in a ceremony the entire kingdom celebrated with feasts and bonfires, and songs that Leora could hear, faintly, carried on the wind, even 300 miles away. And in a forgotten border village with a leaking roof and a fire that kept going out, Leora pressed her hands to her stomach and felt 2 heartbeats that were not her own. The twins came early, in the dead of winter, in a one-room cottage with a roof that wept in the rain and a fire that sputtered and hissed like a dying animal. There was no healer. The nearest one lived 2 villages over, and the snowdrifts had climbed past the windowsills 3 days ago. No horse could move through them. No person should have tried. Leora labored alone for 9 hours, biting down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming, her body tearing itself open to deliver 2 lives into a world that had told her she was incapable of creating even one. The first boy arrived just before midnight, dark-haired, gray-eyed, silent. He did not cry when the cold air hit his skin. He just looked up at her with those wide, impossibly calm eyes, and something inside Leora cracked open that was not pain. It was recognition. She knew that face. She knew whose jawline that was, whose brow, whose steady gaze. She knew exactly what those gray eyes would look like in 30 years, sitting at the head of a long table, choosing duty over love. The second boy came 20 minutes later. Smaller, louder, absolutely furious at the indignity of being born. He screamed the moment he entered the world, and the sound rattled the shutters in their frames. Leora held them both against her chest, trembling with exhaustion and blood loss and a fierce, annihilating love that roared through her body like wildfire. She named the quiet one, Idris. She named the loud one, Soren. And she made a decision in that moment, with her sons pressed against her heart and her blood soaking into the sheets, that would shape every day that followed. She would not send word to Valdenmere. The thought crossed her mind in those first desperate, half-delirious days when the fever set in and the milk would not come and she lay in the dark wondering whether she would survive the week. She could send a message, just a few words. Torvain would come. He would bring healers and warmth and the full weight of the crown to protect his sons. But then what? He would take them, not out of cruelty, but out of the same merciless sense of duty that had driven him to sever their bond. They were heirs. They were the very thing the council had dissolved her marriage to obtain. They would be raised behind the iron walls of the citadel, groomed for succession, paraded before a court that had discarded their mother like a tool that had failed its purpose. They would call Seraphine their queen. They would learn to kneel before a throne that had been purchased with their mother's heartbreak. No, she would die in this cottage before she let that happen. So she survived. Not gracefully, not bravely. She survived out of spite and animal stubbornness, hauling herself out of the fever bed through sheer refusal to leave her sons alone in the world the way she had been left. She learned to nurse 2 infants at once, one on each side, her body aching, her cracked hands raw from washing linens in water so cold it burned. A village woman named Tova, broad-shouldered and quiet, brought broth and brown bread each morning and asked no questions. A retired border guardsman named Breslin chopped firewood and stacked it by her door without ever waiting to be thanked. Thornhaven was small, poor, and utterly forgotten. The kind of place the Crown's tax collectors visited once a year, scribbled a number in a ledger, and never thought about again until the following autumn. It was perfect. It was invisible. And Leora intended to keep it that way. The twins grew fast. All shifter children did, their bodies fed by something deeper than food, but Idris and Soren grew like a fire fed too much kindling. By their first year, they were walking with the sure-footed confidence of children twice their age. By their second, they were speaking in complete sentences, finishing each other's thoughts like 2 rivers branching from the same source. By their third year, Leora noticed the other village children keeping a careful distance from her sons. Not out of cruelty or dislike, out of instinct. Something in Idris and Soren's presence made other wolves lower their eyes and step aside without understanding why. She tried to ignore it. She tried to raise them as ordinary boys in an ordinary village, with ordinary lives that would never draw the attention of anyone powerful enough to take them from her. Idris was gentle and watchful, the kind of child who could sit at the edge of the forest for hours studying the way moss colonized a fallen log or the way light moved through the canopy as the wind shifted. Soren was wildfire, loud and fearless and perpetually climbing things that were not meant to be climbed, falling off them spectacularly, and scaling them again before the first bruise had finished forming. They were beautiful. They were hers. And they were impossible to hide forever. The first shift happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks past their 4th birthday. Soren was angry. A village boy, older and bigger, had snatched his wooden sword, a crude thing Leora had carved herself from a birch branch on a rainy afternoon. Soren's face went red, then white, and then he was gone. Where a furious 4-year-old had been standing, there was a wolf. Small as a fox kit but unmistakable, and white. Pure, brilliant, blinding white, the color of fresh snow under a winter sun. Leora dropped the basket of eggs she had been carrying. They shattered on the packed earth. She could not breathe. Shifter children did not shift until they reached adolescence. 12 years old at the earliest. 14 was common. Never 4. And white wolves had not been seen in the realm for generations. They existed only in old songs and older legends, whispered about in the same breath as prophecy and divine bloodlines. The mark of a lineage so pure it bent the natural order around itself like a river bending around stone. Before she could move, before her mind could even begin to process what she was seeing, Idris shifted beside his brother, quiet and deliberate, as though he had been waiting for exactly this moment. 2 white wolves, small as fox kits, standing side by side in the late afternoon sun of a village where absolutely no one had any business being legendary. Leora dropped to her knees slowly, her hands trembling. Soren trotted over and pressed his cold nose into her palm, tail wagging, completely oblivious to the magnitude of what had just happened. Idris sat at her feet and looked up at her with those calm, knowing eyes that saw far too much for a child his age. "You cannot do this where people can see," she whispered. "You must never let anyone see. Do you understand me? But of course, someone had already seen. Old Breslin stood at the edge of the clearing, a splitting axe dangling loosely from one hand, his weathered face slack with shock. He looked at the wolves. He looked at Leora. He looked at the wolves again. The color drained from his face in slow motion. "Those are Ashcrest wolves," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Leora's blood turned to ice in her veins. "Those boys are the king's sons." She was on her feet immediately, crossing the clearing in 4 strides, her voice dropping to something low and hard and desperate that she had never heard come out of her own mouth before. She stood directly in front of the old man, close enough that he could see every ounce of fear behind her eyes. "Breslin, you say nothing. You tell no one, not your wife, not the village elder, not a single living soul. Swear it." He stared at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived in Thornhaven pregnant and alone and bleeding and had somehow built a life from nothing. Then he looked past her at the 2 small wolves now tumbling over each other in the grass, nipping at each other's ears and yipping with joy, completely unaware that their existence had just become the most dangerous secret in the entire kingdom. "On my life," Breslin said quietly. "Not a word." But secrets are living things. They grow in the dark. They press against the walls that contain them until the cracks begin to show. And a secret this large, a secret that carried the weight of 2 white wolves and a royal bloodline and a king's broken oath, could only stay buried for so long. 300 miles away in the war rooms beneath the iron citadel of Valdenmere, a field report from a border scout was about to land on the desk of the one person in the world Leora had spent 5 years hiding from. And the first line read, "2 unregistered juvenile shifters displaying full transformation. Estimated age, 4 to 5 years. Wolf coloration, white." The report sat on Torvain's desk for 6 hours before he opened it. It had arrived in the usual stack of border dispatches, sandwiched between a tax dispute from the eastern settlements and a request for additional grain stores from a garrison commander who could not spell the word sufficient. Corvin had flagged it with a red seal, which meant it required the king's personal attention, but Torvain had been buried in a trade negotiation that had stretched past midnight, and by the time he reached the bottom of the stack, his eyes burned and his patience had worn down to bare bone. He almost set it aside, almost left it for morning. That decision, the distance between almost and actually, would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first line stopped him cold. Wolf coloration, white. Torvain read it twice, then a third time. Then he stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward and cracked against the stone floor. White wolves. 4 years old. Full transformation. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the desk and forced himself to breathe, but the air tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, the way it tasted before a battle. White wolves had not appeared in the Ashcrest bloodline for 7 generations. They were the stuff of coronation tapestries and children's songs. They were not supposed to exist in a forgotten border village 300 miles from the capital. Unless they were his. The thought landed like a fist to the sternum. He sat down slowly, missed the chair that was no longer there, and ended up on the stone floor with the report still clenched in his white-knuckled grip. 5 years. 5 years since Leora had vanished in the night. 5 years since the healers had pressed their hands to her stomach and declared, with the clinical certainty of men who had never been wrong about anything in their comfortable lives, that the queen was barren. 5 years since he had sat at the head of that long table and chosen the kingdom over the woman who loved him and watched something irreparable break behind her eyes. And in those 5 years, the irony had become a wound that never stopped bleeding. Seraphine, the golden-haired, noble-blooded, council-approved replacement, had not conceived either. Not in the first year, not in the second. Not in any of the years that followed, years filled with healers and tonics and careful scheduling and the slow, suffocating death of a bond that had never truly taken root. Seraphine had left him 14 months ago, quietly, without scandal, returning to her family's estate with a settlement and a silence that suited them both. The council had begun whispering about a third Luna, and now this. He summoned the border scout who had filed the report. The man arrived within the hour, a weathered tracker named Haldrick, who smelled of pine sap and road dust, and who clearly had not expected to be standing in the king's private study at 2 a.m. "Tell me everything," Torvain said. Haldrick described what he had seen. 2 boys, 5 years old at most, shifting in a clearing behind a cottage at the edge of a village called Thornhaven. Full wolves, white as fresh snow. The transformation had been effortless, playful even. The children had treated it like a game. "And their mother?" Torvain asked. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too controlled, too flat. Haldrick hesitated. "Dark hair, healer from what the locals say, keeps to herself. Been there about 5 years." The room tilted. Torvain gripped the edge of his desk. "Her name," he said. "The villagers call her Leora, Your Majesty." The sound that came out of Torvain was not a word. It was low and broken and animal, the sound of a man who had just been told that the worst mistake of his life was infinitely worse than he had imagined. Corvan, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward with quiet alarm. "Your Majesty." "Ready my horse," Torvain said. "Now." Corvan did not argue. He recognized the look in his king's eyes. It was the same look Torvain had worn on the eve of the Greyclaw campaign, the look of a man who had stopped calculating consequences and started moving on pure, desperate instinct. 3 days later, mud-soaked and half-mad with sleeplessness, Torvain stood at the edge of Thornhaven and watched his sons shift into white wolves in a meadow behind a cottage that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. And then Leora closed the door in his face. He knelt in the mud for what felt like hours. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead and ran in cold rivulets down the back of his neck. The village moved around him in cautious silence. He could feel them watching from doorways and windows. This tall stranger in a ruined riding cloak with a silver crest on his collar, kneeling in the dirt like a penitent before a shrine. Eventually the door opened. Not all the way. Just enough for Leora to step onto the threshold with her arms crossed and her expression carved from granite. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled. It carried no trace of the warmth he remembered. The voice that used to hum off-key while she sorted herbs. The voice that used to say his name like it was the only word in the world worth speaking. "Leora." His voice cracked on the second syllable. He hated how much it cracked. "You need to leave this village, Torvain. You do not belong here." "They are mine," he said. The words tore out of him raw and ragged. "Those boys, they are mine." Something flickered across her face, fast and buried deep, but he saw it. Pain. Old, compacted, load-bearing pain that she had been building her entire life on top of. "They are mine," she corrected. "They have been mine for 5 years. Every fever, every nightmare, every hungry winter. Mine." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less sharp. "You had your chance. You chose a crown." "I was wrong." "Yes, you were." She stepped back. "Now leave." The door closed again. Torvain stared at it, water dripping from his jaw, and did not move. He did not leave that night. He did not leave the next morning. He made camp at the edge of the village, in the shelter of a half-collapsed woodshed. And he waited. On the 3rd morning, the loud one found him. Torvain had barely slept. The woodshed leaked in 4 places. The ground was cold and uneven, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Leora's face in the doorway, carved in stone, telling him he did not belong. He was sitting against the wall, staring at nothing, when a small face appeared around the corner of the shed. "Are you the king?" the boy asked. Torvain blinked. The child was small and fierce-looking, with a mess of dark hair and gray eyes that held absolutely no reverence for authority. Soren, the loud one, the one who had shifted first. "Yes," Torvain said, because lying to a child felt like a line he was not prepared to cross. Soren studied him with the brutal honesty only children possessed. "You do not look like a king. You look like a wet dog." Despite everything, despite the rain and the ruined cloak and the hollow ache in his chest, Torvain almost laughed. "That is a fair assessment," he said. "Mama says you need to go away," Soren informed him, climbing onto a stack of firewood and perching there like a small, judgmental bird. "I know. Are you going to?" "No." Soren considered this. "Good," he said. "I want to know why your horse is so big." That was how it started. Not with grand gestures or royal proclamations, with a 5-year-old boy asking about a horse. Soren came back the next day, and the day after that. He was relentless in his curiosity, firing questions like arrows. Why was the horse so tall? Why did the saddle have silver on it? Could wolves eat fish? Had Torvain ever fought a bear? Could he fight a bear right now? Soren would very much like to watch. The boy had no filter and no fear, and he talked with his entire body, gesturing wildly, climbing things mid-sentence, falling off them without pausing for breath. Torvain did not know how to be a father. He had no framework for it, no reference point. His own father had been distant and formal, a man who communicated through advisors and approved schedules. But Soren did not care about frameworks. He just wanted someone to listen to his endless theories about whether wolves or bears would win in a fight, and Torvain found himself listening with an attention that surprised him. Idris took longer. The quiet twin watched from a distance for nearly a week, studying Torvain the way he studied everything, with patient, careful eyes that missed nothing. When he finally approached, he did not speak. He simply sat down beside Torvain outside the woodshed and opened a small leathered journal filled with pressed leaves and careful drawings of plants. "Mama taught me these," Idris said quietly, showing Torvain a page of sketched wildflowers labeled in a child's careful handwriting. "She knows every plant in the forest." "She always did," Torvain murmured, and the ache in his chest was so sharp he had to look away. The boys did not know who he was to them. Leora had told them nothing, and Torvain did not push it. He understood, with a clarity that cut like a blade, that he had not earned the right to that word. Father. He had forfeited it in a great hall 5 years ago. But the twins pulled at something primal in him. When Soren fell out of a tree and came running with a scraped knee, Torvain caught himself moving toward the boy before his mind registered the impulse. When Idris sat beside him in the quiet, their shoulders almost touching, Torvain felt a peace he had not experienced in years. Leora watched from the cottage. He could feel her gaze, wary and measuring, tracking every interaction. She did not stop the boys from visiting him, but she did not encourage it either. She existed in a careful, controlled silence that he recognized because he had built the same kind of walls around himself. On the 9th day, everything shattered. Torvain was speaking with Corvan, who had ridden in that morning with supplies and news from the capital. They stood at the edge of the village, voices low, discussing logistics. "The council will need to know eventually," Corvan said. "White wolves of the Ashcrest line cannot remain hidden in a border village forever. They belong in Valdenmere." "They belong with their mother," Torvain said, but the words came a half-second too late. Because Leora was standing 10 paces behind them, a basket of herbs clutched against her chest, and she had heard every word that came before his correction. The look she gave him could have frozen a river solid. She turned and walked back to the cottage without a sound. When Soren ran to find Torvain that afternoon, the boy looked confused and a little frightened. "Mama says I cannot talk to you anymore," he said. Torvain closed his eyes. He had been here before, standing on the wrong side of a closed door, watching the consequences of his own failures pile up around him like rubble. "Soren, I need you to tell your mother something for me," Torvain said. The boy waited. "Tell her I am not here to take anyone anywhere. Tell her I will sleep in this shed until it collapses around my ears if that is what it takes. Tell her I am sorry." Soren frowned. "Sorry for what?" Torvain looked at this small, fierce boy who had his eyes and his stubbornness and his mother's unshakable courage, and the truth rose in his throat like a stone. "For everything," he said. Soren delivered the message. The cottage door stayed shut. And just before sundown, a column of dust appeared on the southern road. Riders. 8 of them, armored, carrying the banner of the royal council. Lord Aldrich had found them. The riders entered Thornhaven at a walk, their formation tight and deliberate, the kind of approach designed to communicate that resistance was neither expected nor advisable. Lord Aldrich rode at the center, straight-backed and unhurried, his silver hair catching the last light of the dying sun. Behind him, 7 soldiers in council livery sat their horses with the blank-faced discipline of men who followed orders without asking what those orders would cost. Torvain was on his feet before the column had fully entered the village. He positioned himself in the open ground between the riders and the cottage with the casual precision of a man who had spent half his life on battlefields. Corvin appeared at his right shoulder without a word. "Lord Aldrich," Torvain said, his voice carrying the flat, measured tone he reserved for situations where violence was one wrong sentence away. "I did not summon you." The old counselor dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who had been climbing on and off horses since before Torvain was born. He brushed road dust from his cloak and offered a smile that did not reach his slate-colored eyes. "Your Majesty left the capital without notice." The council was concerned. His gaze drifted past Torvain toward the cottage. "We received reports. Unregistered shifters displaying characteristics consistent with the royal bloodline. Surely you understand our interest." "Your interest is noted," Torvain said, "and unwelcome." Aldrich's smile thinned. "The Ashcrest succession is not a private matter. If legitimate heirs exist, the crown has an obligation to secure them, to educate them, to prepare them for the responsibilities of their blood." The door behind Torvain opened. He heard it, felt the shift in the air, and his entire body tensed. Leora stepped out. She moved past Torvain without looking at him and stopped in the open ground, placing herself between the cottage and the councilman like a wall made of flesh and fury. "These are my children," she said. "They are not crown property." Aldrich looked at her the way a man looks at an insect that has landed on his dinner plate. "Ah," he said, "the former queen. We were told you had disappeared. Some assumed you were dead." "Sorry to disappoint," Leora replied. "The children are of royal blood," Aldrich continued, his tone shifting to something harder, something that sounded rehearsed. "The law is clear. Heirs to the Ashcrest line must be raised under the protection and guidance of the crown. Their mother's personal feelings do not supersede the succession." Leora's jaw tightened. "The succession that required my removal?" "Your removal was a matter of biological necessity," Aldrich said smoothly. "The healers confirmed you could not bear children. The council acted in the kingdom's best interest." "The healers were wrong," Leora said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Clearly," Aldrich conceded, "an unfortunate error. But the error changes nothing about the law as it stands today." He signaled to the soldiers. 2 of them dismounted and began moving toward the cottage door. Torvain stepped forward and the temperature in the clearing dropped. "If those men take one more step toward that door," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very still, the voice of a man who had ended wars and did not issue warnings twice. They will regret it for the rest of their very short careers. The soldiers stopped. Aldrich's expression flickered. Your Majesty, the counselor began. You will address me as your king, Torvain said, and you will recall who stands before you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Behind Aldrich, one of the soldiers shifted nervously in his saddle. The horses felt it too, ears flattening, hooves stamping the packed earth. Then old Breslin stepped out of his cottage across the clearing, axe in hand. And Tova appeared in her doorway with a skinning knife, and one by one, the people of Thornhaven emerged from their homes, not with weapons drawn, but with the quiet, unmistakable solidarity of a village that had decided whose side it was on. These people had watched Leora deliver their babies, set their broken bones, sit with their sick through the long nights. She was theirs. Aldrich assessed the situation with the cold efficiency of a man who understood political math. He raised a hand. The soldiers retreated. This is not finished, Aldrich said, his gaze fixed on Torvain. The council will convene. The law will be applied. The law, Torvain repeated, and something dark shifted behind his eyes. Tell me something, Lord Aldrich. The healers who examined my first queen and declared her barren. Who selected them? Aldrich's expression did not change, but his silence lasted one beat too long. Because I have been thinking about that, Torvain continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Aldrich and Leora could hear. I have been thinking about how the woman the council told me could never bear children went on to produce twin white wolf shifters, something this bloodline has not seen in 7 generations. And I have been thinking about how the woman the council selected as her replacement also failed to conceive. I have been thinking about that quite a lot, Lord Aldrich. The old man's face went pale. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the color left his cheeks the way warmth leaves a room when the fire dies. Slowly and completely. And I have been thinking, Torvain said, his voice barely above a whisper, about who had the most to gain from removing a common-born Luna and replacing her with a noble daughter. I have been thinking about whose political alliances benefited, whose family connections strengthened, whose influence over the crown expanded. Leora was staring at Torvain. He could feel the heat of her gaze on the side of his face. You are making a very dangerous accusation, Your Majesty, Aldrich said. I am asking a very simple question, Torvain replied. Did you falsify the diagnosis? The silence that followed was the longest of Torvain's life. Aldrich mounted his horse without answering. He gathered his reins with hands that were not quite steady and turned the animal toward the southern road. This matter will be addressed by the full council, he said. I advise you to return to the capital, Your Majesty. The column departed. Dust rose and settled. The village exhaled. Torvain stood motionless in the fading light, his fists clenched at his sides, the full weight of what he had just implied pressing down on his shoulders like iron. If Aldrich had manipulated the diagnosis, if the council had engineered Leora's removal, then everything that followed was not a tragedy of duty. It was a crime, and he had been its instrument. Behind him, Leora's voice came quiet and raw. Did you know? He turned. She stood in the doorway of the cottage, her hands gripping the frame, her face stripped of every defense she had spent 5 years constructing. Behind her, 2 small faces peered out from the shadows, gray eyes, his eyes. No, he said. The word broke in his mouth. Leora, I swear to you on my life, I did not know. She searched his face. He let her look. He had nothing left to hide behind. But you believed them? She said. You believed them over me. He had no answer for that. Because she was right. He had believed the council over his own mate, and no amount of conspiracy could erase the fact that when it mattered most, he had not fought for her. I will spend the rest of my life making that right, he said. "If you let me." Leora did not respond. She looked at him for a long, unreadable moment, and then she looked down at Soren, who had pressed himself against her leg, and at Idris, who stood just behind her with his small journal clutched against his chest. "Come inside," she said. "The boys need supper." It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was a door, cracked open the width of a single breath. Torvain stepped through it. Supper was quiet. The boys ate with the single-minded focus of children who had spent the afternoon running through wet grass, their faces bent over bowls of root stew, their spoons scraping against clay in a rhythm that filled the silence between the adults who could not find words. Torvain sat at a table he did not build, in a cottage he had never seen, eating food prepared by a woman who had every reason to poison it. The stew was good, earthy and warm and seasoned with herbs he could not name, but recognized from another life, from a kitchen in Valdenmere, where Leora used to hum while she worked, and he used to lean against the doorframe and watch her like a man who had no idea how lucky he was. Soren talked with his mouth full. He told Torvain about a fox he had seen near the river, about a rock shaped like a wolf's head, about how Idris had once tried to befriend a hedgehog and gotten pricked in the nose. Idris blushed furiously and kicked his brother under the table. Soren yelped and kept talking. Leora said nothing. She moved between the fire and the table with practiced economy, refilling bowls, wiping hands, keeping her gaze anywhere but on the man sitting in her home. When the boys were in bed, when the cottage had settled into the deep quiet of a house where children have finally stopped moving, Leora sat down across from Torvain and folded her hands on the table. "Ask," she said. Torvain looked at her. "You want to know about the birth, about the early years, about everything you missed." Her voice was level, stripped down to bedrock. "So ask, because this is the only time I am going to talk about it." He swallowed. "Were you alone?" "Yes." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "The nearest healer was 2 villages away and the snow was too deep to travel. I labored for 9 hours. I delivered them myself." She paused. "Both of them." Torvain's hands clenched on the table. His knuckles went white. "Idris came first. He did not cry. He just looked at me." Something moved across her face, a ghost of tenderness that surfaced and vanished. Soren screamed loud enough to rattle the shutters. He has not stopped screaming since. She told him about the fever that followed, about the 3 days she could not stand, about Tova bringing broth and Breslin leaving firewood, and neither of them asking questions she could not have answered. She told him about the first winter, about nursing 2 infants in a cottage with gaps in the walls wide enough to let the wind through, about nights so cold she slept with both boys inside her coat because the blankets were not enough. She told him about the loneliness, not dramatically, not with tears or accusations. She described it the way someone describes weather. It was simply there, a condition of her existence. The long, dark evenings when the boys were asleep and the silence pressed in, and there was no one to talk to, no one to share the small victories or absorb the constant, grinding fear that she was not enough for them. Torvain listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself or explain or qualify. He sat in that small cottage and he let every word land on him like a blow he had earned. When she finished, the fire had burned down to embers, and the room was lit only by the dim orange glow of the coals. "I should have fought for you," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "When the council brought their recommendation, when the healers gave their diagnosis, I should have refused. I should have told Aldrich and every man in that room that I did not care about succession or bloodlines or the future of the crown. I should have chosen you." "Yes," Leora said. "You should have." "I was afraid," he continued, and the admission cost him something visible. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped, the way the carefully maintained architecture of kingship crumbled and left behind something smaller and rawer and more human than she had expected to find. I was afraid that if I refused the council, the kingdom would fracture, that the noble houses would withdraw support, that everything my father built would collapse, because I chose my own heart over the realm. And instead, Leora said quietly, everything collapsed anyway. He closed his eyes. She was right. Seraphine had left. The council had grown more powerful in his weakness. The succession remained empty. The kingdom he had sacrificed his mate to preserve had not been preserved at all. It had simply rotted from a different direction. I am not asking you to forgive me, he said, opening his eyes. I have not earned that. I may never earn it. You have not, she agreed. But I need you to know that losing you was the moment I stopped being able to live with myself. He paused. Not because of the twins. I did not know about them. I mean losing you. Just you. The person. The woman I loved. That loss broke something in me that I have been pretending is intact for 5 years. Leora stared at him. In the dim light, he looked nothing like a king. He looked tired and hollowed out and desperately honest, and she hated him a little for it, because it would have been so much easier to keep him on the other side of the door if he had stayed behind his walls. A sound came from the back room. Small, frightened, the half-swallowed cry of a child in the grip of a bad dream. Leora rose immediately, but Torvain was already moving. Instinct, not thought. The same instinct that had driven him toward Soren's scraped knee. The same pull that bypassed every rational thought and went straight to something older and deeper. He reached the doorway first and stopped. Idris was sitting up in bed, breathing hard, his small hands twisted in the blanket. Soren slept undisturbed beside him. Torvain knelt beside the bed. He did not touch the boy. He simply knelt there, close enough that Idris could see him in the dark. Bad dream? He asked softly. Idris nodded, his lower lip trembling. I get those too, Torvain said. The boy looked at him with those quiet, too old eyes. What do you do when they come? Torvain thought about this. He thought about the empty chambers in Valdenmere, the sleepless nights, the hollow silence of a palace that had become a monument to his mistakes. I wait for morning, he said, and I remind myself that the dream is not the truth. Idris considered this with the gravity of a child who understood more than any child should need to. Then he lay back down, pulled the blanket to his chin, and closed his eyes. Will you stay until I fall asleep? He asked. Torvain's throat closed. Yes, he managed. I will stay. Behind him, in the doorway she had been standing in since the moment he moved, Leora pressed her hand against her mouth and breathed through the ache that was splitting her chest wide open. In the morning, Torvain told her he was leaving. Leora stood at the cottage door, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The boys were in the clearing, Soren chasing a butterfly with the same intensity he brought to everything. Idris sitting cross-legged in the grass with his journal open and a stick of charcoal moving carefully across the page. I have to go back to Valdenmere, Torvain said, not for the reasons you think. She waited. Aldrich will return with the full authority of the council behind him. Legal writs, armed escorts, a formal order to seize the boys as crown assets. The word tasted like poison in his mouth. I cannot stop that from here. I have to go back and dismantle it at the source. And the boys? Leora asked. Her voice was carefully controlled, but he could hear the fear beneath it, thin and sharp as a blade edge. Stay with you. Here, in Thornhaven, where they are safe and loved and known. I am not taking them anywhere. He paused. I am not taking anything from you ever again. She studied his face, searching for the lie, the political calculation, the hidden angle. He let her look. He had nothing left to conceal. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to remove Aldrich from the council. I am going to launch an investigation into the healers who declared you barren and who authorized their appointment. I am going to dissolve the succession law that treats children as property of the crown rather than as people." He stopped. "And then, if you will allow it, I am going to come back." "And if I will not allow it?" He took a breath. "Then I will still do all of those things. Because they are right. And because you and those boys deserved better than what the kingdom gave you. And fixing that does not require your permission. It only requires mine." Leora blinked. For the first time in days, something shifted behind her eyes that was not anger or suspicion, or the exhausted vigilance of a woman who had spent 5 years expecting the worst. It was surprise. The genuine, disarming surprise of a woman who had been prepared for every version of this conversation, except the one where he asked for nothing in return. "You are different," she said. "I am ruined," he corrected quietly. "There is a difference." She almost smiled. He saw the ghost of it pass across her mouth before she caught it and pressed her lips together. He knelt in front of the boys before he left. Soren grabbed his hand and informed him that if he did not come back, Soren would find him personally, and this was not a threat, but a promise. Torvain promised to return. Idris said nothing. He reached into his journal, tore out a page, and handed it to Torvaine. It was a drawing. 2 wolves, white, running side by side through a forest, and behind them, larger, a third wolf, dark gray, running with them. Torvain folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside his coat, against his chest. He rode for Valdenmere that afternoon. The return journey took 2 days of hard riding, and he spoke to no one the entire way. The council session that followed would be talked about for years. Torvain entered the chamber in riding clothes, unannounced, and what he did to the political structure of the Ashcrest court was systematic and total. Aldrich was stripped of his position and placed under investigation. The 2 healers who had examined Leora were summoned and questioned. One of them broke within the hour, confessing that the diagnosis had been pressured, that Aldrich had made it clear what the findings needed to say, and that the actual examination had been inconclusive. Inconclusive. Not barren. Inconclusive. Torvain sat in the great hall where he had once ended his marriage and felt the full weight of 5 wasted years settle on his shoulders. Every sleepless night Leora had endured. Every fever. Every hungry winter. Every moment she had spent raising his sons alone while he sat on a throne and believed the lie that had put him there. He reformed the succession laws. He dissolved the provision that allowed the council to compel bond severance. He issued a formal decree recognizing Idris and Soren Ashcrest as his legitimate sons and heirs, with a secondary clause that their place of residence and upbringing would be determined solely by their mother. The court was stunned. The noble houses whispered. Lord Aldrich's allies scrambled. Torvain did not care. He rode back to Thornhaven on a clear morning, 3 weeks after he had left. He came alone this time. No beta, no soldiers, no banners. Just a man on a tired horse, carrying a folded drawing against his heart. He saw them before they saw him. Soren was up a tree, naturally. Idris was reading beneath it, and Leora was in the garden, her hands deep in the dark earth, planting something that would take months to bloom. She looked up when she heard the horse. She stood slowly, brushing the soil from her palms. He dismounted. He walked toward her. He stopped at a distance that respected every boundary she had drawn around herself for 5 years. "It is done," he said. "Aldrich is gone. The diagnosis was a lie. The succession laws have been rewritten. The boys are recognized as my sons, and you have sole authority over where and how they are raised." He paused. "I asked for nothing in return. I am asking for nothing now." Leora looked at him. The wind moved through the clearing, carrying the smell of turned earth and new growth, and the distant sound of Soren arguing with a bird. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." "People say many things." "I am not people," he said. "I am the man who wronged you, and I will spend every remaining day of my life proving that I am capable of being better than the worst thing I have ever done." She crossed the distance between them. She stood close enough that he could smell the earth on her hands, and the lavender in her hair, and the scent that had never fully left his memory no matter how many years or miles he put between them. "The boys missed you," she said. "Just the boys?" She looked up at him, and for the first time in 5 years, she let him see the truth. Not the armor, not the walls, not the fierce, untouchable composure that had kept her alive and sane and standing. The truth beneath all of it. "No," she said, "not just the boys." He reached for her slowly, the way you reach for something precious that you have broken once and are terrified of breaking again. His hands cupped her face. His thumbs traced the lines that 5 years of solitude had carved beside her mouth. "I will not ask you to be my queen," he whispered. "I am asking you to let me be worthy of you." She put her hands over his. She closed her eyes. "Start by fixing the roof," she said. "It has been leaking for 3 years." Behind them, Soren fell out of the tree. Idris sighed without looking up from his book. 2 white wolves shimmered at the edges of 2 small boys, catching the light like something out of an old song that everyone had forgotten was true. Months later, on a morning so still the world seemed to be holding its breath, Torvain Ashcrest knelt in the mud outside a cottage in Thornhaven. Not in grief this time, not in desperation or despair, or the shattering realization that he had destroyed the only thing that mattered. He knelt because Soren had tackled him at the knees, and Idris had joined the ambush from behind, and 2 small white wolves were now sitting on his chest in the wet grass, while he laughed so hard he could not breathe. The cottage door was open. The roof no longer leaked. Herbs grew in neat rows along the south wall, and a new fence enclosed the garden where Leora had planted wildflowers that were just beginning to push through the dark earth. She stood in the doorway, a cup of tea warming her hands, watching the 3 of them with an expression that she had only recently allowed herself to wear. It was not the guarded vigilance of the years alone. It was not the brittle composure she had carried like a shield. It was something softer, something that had been growing quietly, like the flowers, in soil that had been barren for a very long time. Torvain looked up at her from the ground, his hair full of mud, one wolf cub gnawing on his boot, the other licking his ear. "A little help?" he called. "You seem to be handling it," she replied. He grinned. She smiled. And the distance between those 2 expressions, the grin of a man who had learned to kneel and the smile of a woman who had learned to let someone back in, was 5 years and 300 miles, and the full length of a second chance that neither of them had expected to receive. The boys shifted back, breathless and laughing, and Torvain gathered them both against his chest and held them the way he should have held them from the beginning. Leora set down her tea. She crossed the clearing. She sat beside him in the wet grass, not caring about the mud, not caring about the cold, and leaned her shoulder against his. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her temple. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For what?" "For not giving up on me." Leora closed her eyes. The bond between them, the one that had been severed and grieved and denied and rebuilt from rubble, hummed quietly in her chest like a second heartbeat. "Do not make me regret it," she said. He wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. The boys piled into their laps. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, spilling gold across the clearing and the cottage, and the 4 of them tangled together in the grass. The door stayed open.